Risk Management Lecture number 5. In the previous lecture, we discussed the quantitative risk analysis tools and techniques such as sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis, probability analysis, expected value analysis, decision tree analysis, PERT analysis, and the simulation technique. In this lecture, we will discuss two processes of the project risk management process. First one is the risk response, the other is the risk monitoring. First, let's discuss the risk response process. Risk response is the process of developing strategic option and determining action to enhance opportunity and reduce threats to the project objective. Again, to enhance opportunity and reduce threats to the project objective. A project team member is assigned to take responsibility for each risk response. This ensures that each risk has an owner monitoring the responses, although the risk owner may delegate implementation of a response to someone else, but still the risk owner is the one responsible for monitoring the responses. Risk response strategies include for threats, 4 strategies such as avoid, transfer, mitigate, acceptance. 4 opportunities, exploit, share, enhance, and acceptance. Let's first discuss the risk response strategy for threats. First one is avoid. Risk can be avoided by removing the cause of the risk or executing the project in a different way that could achieve project objective. Avoid risk should be the first strategy to consider. First, we should consider to avoid the risk completely. However, not all risk can be avoided or eliminated. That's why we can go to the other risk response strategies. This approach may be too expensive or time consuming to avoid. That means that to avoid completely the risk, this could consume a lot of cost and a lot of time. The second risk response strategy for threats is risk transfer. Transferring risk involves finding another party who is willing to take the responsibility for its management and who will bear the liability for the risk should it occur. This is one example of risk insurance or insurance companies. The aim is to ensure that the risk is owned and managed by the party best able to deal with it effectively. Risk transfer usually involves payment of a premium within an insurance policy. The third risk response strategy for threats is mitigate. Risk mitigation reduces the probability and or impact of an adverse risk event to an acceptable threshold. That means if we can't eliminate completely the risk, but still we can mitigate its impact or reduce the probability or impact of its adverse risk to an acceptable threshold. Taking early action to reduce the probability and or impact of a risk is often more effective than trying to repair the damage after the risk has occurred. Risk mitigation may require resources or time and thus presents a trade-off between doing nothing versus the cost of mitigating the risk. That means that we have two options, either to do nothing and wait for the risk to happen, or the cost of mitigating the risk before it occurs and or reduce the probability and impact of the adverse risk event. Fourth risk response strategy for threats is acceptance. This strategy is adopted when it is not possible or practical to respond to the risk by the other strategies. If we fail to respond to the risk by any of the 3 previously mentioned strategies, we can accept the risk. Or a response is not warranted by the importance of the risk. When the project manager and the project team decide to accept a risk, they are agreeing to address the risk if and when it occurs. They will do nothing and wait until the risk occurs, and then they will manage its effect on the project objective. To do that, a contingency plan, workaround plan, or contingency reserve may be developed for that event eventually. The contingency reserve will be used to pay the cost of the risk when it happens in the project. For risk response strategies for opportunities include exploit, share, enhance, and acceptance. First, let's explain the exploit strategy. The aim for exploit is to ensure that the opportunity is realized. This strategy seeks to eliminate the uncertainty associated with a particular upside risk by making the opportunity definitely happen. We will force or will try to make this opportunity occur in the project or happens to us. Exploit is an aggressive response strategy best reserved for those golden opportunities. We will not use exploit for all the opportunities we have, but we will only reserve it for golden opportunities having a high probability and impact for occurring. The second risk response strategy for opportunity is share. Allocate risk ownership of an opportunity to another party who is best able to maximize its probability of occurrence and benefit if it occurs. This is transferring threats and sharing opportunities are similar. What we do in sharing or threats, we will do transferring threats is with sharing opportunities, and the third party is used. Those to whom opportunities are allocated should be allowed to share in the potential benefits. Whoever will be sharing the opportunity with us will take the benefits of the risk when it occurs. The third risk response strategy for opportunity is enhance. This response aims to modify the size of the positive risk. We will change its size. The opportunity is enhanced by increasing its probability and or impact, thereby maximizing benefits realized for the project. If the opportunity can be increased to 100%, this is effectively an exploit response, not an enhance. That means whatever percent less than 100 will be considered as enhance strategy, but once it gets to 100% will be considered as exploit. The last risk response strategy for opportunity is similar to what we do with threats, is acceptance. If we fail to do any of the three other risk response strategy for opportunity, we go to acceptance. This strategy is adopted when it is not possible or practical to respond to the risk by the other strategies, or a response is not warranted by the importance of the risk. When the project manager and the project team decided to accept the risk, they are agreeing to address the risk if and when it occurs. A contingency plan, workaround plan, and or contingency reserve may be developed for that opportunity. Let's show some examples of risk responses in design phase. First, the statement stated that inaccuracies or incompleteness or incomplete information in the survey file could lead to rework of the design. The risk response recommended is mitigate. Work with the surveys to verify that the survey file is accurate and complete. Perform additional survey as needed. Once we perform additional survey, we can mitigate, we can reduce the probability or impact of the risk once it occurs. The second example of risk response in the design phase stated that a design change that is outside of the parameters contemplated in the environmental document triggers a supplemental environmental impact report, which causes a delay due to the public comment period. The risk response recommended for this risk is avoid. Monitor design changes against environmental document from the beginning to avoid reassessment of environmental document unless the opportunity outweighed the threats. The first example of risk response in the construction phase states that hazardous materials encountered during construction will require an on-site storage area and the potential additional cost to dispose. The risk response recommended for this risk is we will accept this risk, meaning we ensure storage space will be available. The second example of risk response in construction phase state that unanticipated buried man-made objects uncovered during construction require removal and disposal, resulting in additional cost. The recommended risk response is accept, meaning include a supplemental work item to cover this risk. Responding to risk. Following identification and analysis of project risk, the project risk management team takes action in response to the risk to improve the odds in favor of project success. Ultimately, it is not possible to eliminate all threats or take advantage of all opportunities, but they will be documented to provide awareness that they exist and have been identified. Successful risk response will change the risk profile through the project life cycle, and risk exposure will diminish. The project risk management team determines which risk warrant a response and identifies which strategy is best for each risk. Risk response involves assigning an action to risk owner to identify options for reducing the probability or impact of each risk. The risk owner takes the lead and can involve experts available to the project. Risk response involves also evaluating each option for potential reduction in the risk and the cost of implementing the option. Risk response involves selecting the best option for project, involves also requesting additional contingency if required, involves also assigning an action to the risk owner to execute the selected response action. The risk owner is the lead and may assign specific tasks to other resources to have the response implemented and documented. The risk response action for each risk. To enter the risk response into the risk register, the risk response action for each risk is entered into the responses action column in the risk register Excel sheet, as we discussed in the previous 4 lectures. We will discuss also in this lecture the risk monitoring process within the project risk management process. Risk monitoring, continuous monitoring by the project risk manager and the project team ensures that the new and changing risk. Let's emphasize on that there always be new and changing risk throughout the life cycle of the project. Again, continuous monitoring by the project risk manager and the project team ensure that the new and changing risks are detected and managed, and that risk response actions are implemented and effective. Risk monitoring continues for the life of the project. Risk monitoring and control keeps track of the identified risk, residual risk, new risk. Risk monitoring and control keeps track of the identified risks from the beginning, residual risks, that is the risk remains after we manage the identified risk, new risk that occurs or appears throughout the life cycle of the project. It also monitors the execution of the planned strategies for the identified risk and evaluate their effectiveness. Risk monitoring and control continues for the life of the project. The list of project risk changes as the project matures. New risk develop or anticipated risk disappear. Risk rating and prioritization can also change during the project life cycle. Typically, during project execution, risk meetings should be held regularly to update the status of risk in the risk register and add new risks. Periodic project risk reviews repeats the process of identification, analysis, and response planning in each period. If an anticipated risk emerges or a risk impact is greater than the expected, the planned response may not be adequate. The project manager and the project risk management team should perform additional responses to control the risks. Monitoring also determines whether the project risk management team is performing periodic risk reviews and updates or not, the risk management policies or procedure are being followed or not, the remaining contingency reserve for the cost and the schedule are adequate or not adequate. Monitoring may involve recommending alternative risk response, implementing a contingency plan, taking corrective actions, changing the project objective, risk review and updating. The review tasks of the project risk management team includes the following: identify, analyze, and plan response action for the newly arising risk and add them to the risk register. Review the execution of the risk response action and evaluate their effectiveness. Also include reassessing existing risk, verify that the assumptions are still valid, and modify the previous assessment as necessary. Assign additional risk response action to the risk owner. Retire risk those whose opportunity to impact the project has elapsed, or whose residual impact on the project is deemed to have reached an acceptable level. Lesson learned. The team is essentially asking itself, what, if anything, would we have done differently and why? When a risk is retired, the project risk management team will review the history of the risk to record any lesson learned regarding the risk management process used. This concludes the project risk management process with its 5 processes: risk identification, quantitative risk analysis, qualitative risk analysis, quantitative risk analysis, risk response, and risk monitoring. And thank